1980s for our generation was profoundly formative and transformative. And to think that there are people that I work with on a daily basis who don't know it. I've wanted to tell the story for many years. But the other prompt was the horror, the absolute horror of the global rise of the right wing and authoritarian populism. And
Our Parliament's ad hoc committee begins week 6 of testimony. This as it digs deep into major national security issues. Today, Mary de Haas of the KZN Violence Monitor is on the stand. De Haas has come under fire from Konazi, who labelled her a desktop researcher and accused her of pushing for the disbanding of the political killings task team.
You are saying it is unheard of. Everything that you have said here today goes back to the 80s. You are stuck in the 80s way of policing. I'm saying.
Well, that was Action SA Member of Parliament Derelene James speaking at the Parliamentary Ad Hoc Committee, looking into the misbehaviour of the South African Police Services in 2025, and she was questioning Violence Monitor Mary de Haas, who had spoken about her long experience that started some 50 years ago of monitoring the old apartheid South African police force, as it was then, and who has continued to do so today, known as the South African Police Services. Now, I don't mean to embarrass Ms. James about her comment, but as I've been monitoring that, it jumped out at me because simultaneous to my work in supporting Mary de Haas, who has been a very close personal friend and fellow social worker, to deal with the misbehavior of the SAPS today, I've been simultaneously deeply immersed in the misbehavior of the South African police force 40 years ago in 1985. So when Ms. James put out that thing, it just leapt out at me because I know she was, I think, about 10 at the time and won't have probably too much recall of it. But I've been looking into the 1980s in quest of understanding the life and times of a progressive Federal Party politician whose life story I have found to be hugely inspirational to me today in my work as a social worker, working with Mary de Haas, to hold the feet of the police to the fire today because of the way they have failed to protect whistleblowers. So folk know me in terms of that's what I'm doing, and I'm trying to make sure I can do that competently by understanding history.
I'd just like to say my real thanks to all of you for being here, for your support during this past, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. Wearing a uniform, whether it be the SAP or the SADF, you are labelled as being part of the system. This is an incontrovertible fact.
Her name was Molly Blackburn. She lived and died in quest of justice, especially for the vulnerable and disadvantaged, as I know Miss James wants to do too as an MP. I've written a biography about Molly, which is in the works to be published next year. But this conversation's not about that book. It's about another book that has already been published, which stands adjacent to my book, and it's titled 1985, The Langa Massacre and the Ending of White Rule in South Africa, written by Professor Mark Swilling and published by UJ Press on open source. Now, my one idea of actually writing the book about Molly is the next book I'm going to probably write is the story behind writing the story about Molly Blackburn, because Mark Swilling has played a pivotal role in helping me get my head around what was going on in 1985. And over the past 2 years, I've been working on our respective books in parallel, comparing notes, sharing research, overcoming hurdles together. And Mark and I, in fact, do go back to the 80s. We were undergraduates together, so I've known him for a long time. But I never knew until I'd started this project that he had written his PhD thesis on the Langa Massacre until Professor Janet Cherry put me onto it. Now, 2.5 years ago, I contacted Janet introduced by Di Oliver, who had worked very closely with Molly. People might remember her as Di Bishop, who's been very much supporting me and helping me in writing this book. I went down to the Eastern Cape, met with Janet on the beachfront, and she said to me, well, John, the first thing you need to do is read Mark Swilling's PhD thesis. And she gave it to me, and I read it and found it so inspiring. And that is why I'm now here 2.5 years later, so excited to have Janet, who has joined me in this conversation, to interact with Mark, to bring history alive into the present. Janet, I think you need to introduce yourself, because I'll be accused of being a bit of like an mbongi or praise singer for you, because you're also one of my inspirations, because interestingly, I learned, as will be revealed in the book, my book, is that on the very night that the Langa Massacre happened, the End Conscription campaign was founded as a branch in Port Elizabeth with Molly Blackburn and others supporting you. So there's a lovely serendipity about that. And of course, I was part of the End Conscription campaign as a conscious objector. So, but that story is for another day. But Janet, please introduce yourself first.
Great. Well, thanks, John, for organizing this. I think it's a really interesting interaction. And I've been thinking a lot about 1985. So about myself, I'm currently a professor of development studies at Nelson Mandela University here in Gqeberha, where I've been living for the last 40 years now. And there's a long story behind that. But I don't know, I would describe myself as an activist scholar, critical intellectual, somebody who's a lifelong activist in the fields of human rights, social justice, a revolutionary as well as an anti-war activist, if that makes sense. So all those things, and I'm still involved in all of those things in many fronts.
Mark, let's take it over from there and just tell us a bit about where you were 2.5 years ago when I got hold of you and I said, Mark, can we chat about the Langa Massacre? Let me remind you, you had just told me that you were about to get a sabbatical and you had all these days accumulated, and you needed to do something with it. And then I told you about this and I said, Mark, can I have a copy of your thesis in electronic form? And you said to me, oh, I don't even have one myself. and one thing led to another. And I found an electronic copy of your PhD thesis. The next thing you said, my gosh, this is so interesting. And you've beaten me to it. You've published your book before I've done mine. And I'm so pleased you have. Firstly, just give us a narrative arc of your story and what happened in this brief, without giving too much away, because we want, after all, people to get the book and read it. But it is quite an extraordinary event, the Langa Massacre, particularly in the context of South Africa, the fact that it happened 25 years after the Sharpeville Massacre.
In brief, there was a group of people who were going to attend a funeral, and they were living in Langa Township, which is adjacent to the central business district of Uitenhage, an old so-called black spot that was supposed to not be there, a la the Apartheid schema. And they were going to march through Uitenhage to Kwanabootle, where the funeral was going to take place. And there was confusion about whether the funeral had been banned or not. And they were confronted with two Caspers who parked in a V along Maduna Road to stop them from going through Uitenhage. And they argued that they stopped this crowd from going through Uitenhage because they were intent on killing white people. That's what they said in the Canada Commission of Inquiry that happened afterwards. And so, there was a massacre, which I call that chapter the story of a bicycle, because I'm very interested in the irony of the fact that there was a strikebreaker called Bukwe who decided he's not going to join the crowd. He's going to go to work because he didn't want to lose his job. So he went to work a little bit later than normal. He got on his bicycle, drove down the side streets and came into Maduna Road. And as he came into Maduna Road, there were the two Caspers on his left, and on his right was the crowd. And he decided to turn towards the Caspers, drive between them, and as he put it, to assure the crowd that he's not a strikebreaker, because obviously he felt guilty. He turned around and waved. And at that point was shot, because obviously the police thought he had some petrol bomb or something. But they denied his existence. So the chapter is called "The Story of a Bicycle" because it's the ironies of the strikebreaker, who eventually became the hero, because he ended up coming in to the Kanema Commission after the police had insisted there's no bicycle, because if they admitted the bicycle, they would have had to admit they shot first. And he came into the courtroom supported by Molly Blackburn, who had hid him in her house, and said, I'm the guy on the bicycle. And that completely discredited the evidence of the police.
Which, of course, will now get everybody wanting to buy my book, because I tell that story and just the extraordinary irony of it. But maybe, Janet, you were somebody on the ground also, because that day happened, and I've included in my book just you getting a call from Mark Lowe and saying, they're killing us and you need to get out there. So just tell us a little bit about your experience of that day.
So first, just to say that, it's important not to see the Langa Massacre as an isolated incident. So there'd been a build-up to this from about September the previous year. And I remember Fix Gqeberha, who was a Makusa leader, a trade union leader, his brother, Leslie Gqeberha, was, I think, the first person to be killed in Uitenhage by, I think, a petrol bomb or an attack on his house, on his home. By some sinister forces. Anyway, that sort of escalated the tension. And, by March, I think it was already extremely tense situation in Uitenhage, but also in the townships of Port Elizabeth at the time. I'm just trying to think what happened before the Langa Massacre. 17th of March, the unions and the community organizations together called for a Black Weekend. And the Black Weekend was a consumer boycott and 3-day stay away, which was going to have an impact on the economy locally. And it did have an impact on the economy. There was some conflict between the unions and the main unions and the UDF organizations. But in Uitenhage, they did, if I remember correctly, actually, the unions with big support in the black townships, I think, were almost universally in support of this stay away. But during that stay away, a number of youth were shot dead by the police. And that was the context in which the funerals were organized. And then, as Mark told the story about, the funeral was banned. So things were already very tense. But meanwhile,
sorry, Janet, just on that.
Yeah.
I got, after the book started circulating a few weeks ago, I got a WhatsApp message from a union organizer in 1985 in Uitenhage who said his role was to go around Uitenhage to tell people the funerals were banned. So the unions were anticipated this was going to be a disastrous moment and tried to stop it. It was quite interesting. I didn't know that.
The thing was that parallel to all these other campaigns and events that were going on, I was involved with the formation of the End Conscription campaign, and just by chance, our launch of that campaign was scheduled for that day on the 21st of March in St. Mary's Cathedral in central of Port Elizabeth. And in some odd way, it was quite appropriate, because we had this terrible news about what had happened in Langa, and we were launching what was essentially an anti-war campaign to encourage young white South Africans to not participate in the military. Of course, the army had already been called into the townships of PE and Uitenhage by that stage, I think. Just Mark, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but by the way, I did quite a lot of in-depth research on this, because I was working for the Truth Commission as well. and had access to some of the security police archives and records, which indicated to me their understanding of the situation.
Tell us about your own journey of consciousness into writing this book.
Well, I've wanted to translate an academic text that I wrote back in the 90s in a popular format for quite some years now. And I think I was prompted by two dynamics. The one is an increasing number of younger staff in my center, as well as younger PhDs, I realized had no idea, no understanding whatsoever of the 1980s. The 1980s for people like Janet and me and our generation was profoundly formative and transformative. And to think that there are people that I work with on a daily basis who don't know it meant they actually didn't know me. And the same applies to my children. So I've wanted to tell the story for many years. But the other prompt was the horror, the absolute horror of the global rise of the right wing and authoritarian populism, and meeting people who around the world who were asking me questions. Well, how do we fight this? And you South Africans did that a while ago. What can you say to us? And so these two came together. And fortuitously, you then sent me the PDF version of my PhD, which I never knew existed. And I read it actually in one shot. I think I was on a plane journey, and I was absolutely amazed about when you read something. I'm sure you've had this experience that you've written many years ago, and you think, who actually wrote this? Which version of me wrote this? And I think what struck me most of all was the way I wrote about violence. I was actually quite shocked and horrified about the way I wrote about violence in quite an instrumentalist way, and living in an extremely violent society, looking back at a time when I looked at violence in an instrumental way rather than as something that is going to destroy us. I wondered, what was it about me that made that possible? And I wanted to explore that through kind of reworking all of that, and actually coming to terms with an experience during those years when I gave evidence in support of the defense of Ashley Forbes, when I engaged with these Umkhonto Wesizwe soldiers, and I provided evidence to say that the state had declared war on the opposition, and therefore they should be treated as prisoners of war. And I think that was actually the lens that I understood violence in the 80s. I don't think it's a good thing, actually, because we thought that violence would go away, but it didn't. It just morphed into something else. So that's really my journey. I mean, in parallel to, I think I'm very involved in government at the moment, in the National Planning Commission and the National Transmission Company of South Africa and various other structures. And as government and the state becomes increasingly distant from society, this was my way of reconnecting to really the origins of our democracy. It was, for me, cathartic in that way.
Janet, can you just reflect a little bit about what Mark said? Because as I know you too, you and I have come to sort of that sharing that deep sense of trying to seek the things that make for peace, seeking to actually defuse and the prospect of things becoming more violent in this country today.
When I think about 1985 and the level of violence that escalated in where I was living here in the townships of Gqeberha, Gqeberha, Uitenhage as it was then, I'm also shocked. And at the time, it's very hard to remember how you understood or perceived things at a particular point in history. So people say now, look, 1985 was this turning point. It was the uprising. It was this sort of glorious moment of struggle and so on. But I didn't experience it like that. I think when I reflect on my youth, and I was very much a revolutionary who was part of the ANC underground, and my alignment was clear, but I could not, my whole life, reconcile that with the violence that was being used. So I found it very difficult to think about these things. In 1985, I just wanted to reflect that I came to Port Elizabeth in the beginning of 1984, and I was already a sort of dedicated revolutionary activist, etc. I'd been involved with the formation of the UDF in Cape Town. I'd been in the national leadership of NUSAS, the student movement. So I came here with all these connections with the youth and trade unions and student organizations, and worked with them very well in 1984. And then at the end of 1984, things started escalating. And on the one level, there were like these different levels. On the one level, there's the building of a genuine mass movement around civic demands, workers' rights. If you remember, 1984, I think, was when Ford closed down its company and thousands of workers lost their jobs. So there were all these dynamics going on, and people in the townships, the African townships of Nelson Mandela Bay, were incredibly well organized. And this, of course, went back through a long history of good organization from the 1950s, from when the ANC was really a force in the townships here. And anyway, without going into too much of the history, that development of this mass mobilization, this mass organization, was both democratic and inspired by a revolutionary program. So it was part of the ANC's 4 pillars of struggle, coming from the Green Book, etc., etc. But it was also a genuinely organic movement and the building of really strong democratic structures. And that was what I looked at in my doctoral thesis, was actually the positive side of that building of really grassroots level, street level participation, where people felt that they owned the streets, even under apartheid repression, even with those police surrounding the townships, people actually took ownership of those streets. So they said to me, and I've quoted this in my thesis, they said, you can't tell me about democracy. We know democracy, we built it ourselves. And I thought that was quite profound. Anyway, so we did a project on this in the early 90s with Johnny Steinberg, among other people. And in that, we interrogated this concept of civil society and whether what was happening in the 80s was really insurrectionary, was it sort of Leninist, was it intolerant? What was the level of tolerance? What was the level? How did people deal with violence? I mean, these are incredibly difficult questions. And for me, they still are. But just to say, I wanted to just say one thing about Molly, and that is, what would Molly have thought now about what happened with the situation in Stilfontein a year ago, and what we call Vala Umgodi? And I'm talking about police now, police actions. So a year ago, I was involved with talking to Judy Chalmers, Molly Blackburn's sister, who is still alive and very active. And she was a leader in her own right in the Black Sash and in Parliament. She was an ANC representative in Parliament for, I think, 3 terms in Parliament. And she called me together with Paul Verheyen at the end of last year to discuss the situation in Stilfontein, in the mine shafts where the Zamazamas were dying of starvation. And it was a horrifying situation, and we were trying to intervene and to persuade people in government to intervene in that situation. Now, the responses from people within government and within the ANC to me were absolutely horrifying reflection of how they had adopted what I called a xenophobic populist narrative in their way of dealing with the situation. But it did reflect something about the police operations as well, and how the police were, can I say, othering the people who were the targets of their action.
Mm.
And they were not
Exactly.
seeing them as human.
Mm.
And that is what enabled them to engage in this very brutal process. Anyway, it made me think, like, what would Molly have done? What would she have said in this context? And how do we take up these kinds of issues in a principled way?
I think the main thing that I learned about writing the book is to realize the significance of 1985 as a year. And I don't think I've fully realized that. And in particular, the role that the Langa Massacre played. What really influenced that thinking is that since the 1980s, people like Neil Barnard, the head of the National Intelligence Service, and Fani Klutter, who was a chief director in the Department of Constitutional Development, working for Chris Yunus, and others have written about those years, and they were people in government advising the president and ministers, and their perception of what we were up to, if I can put it that way, what the mass democratic movement was doing. Their perception of it was, this is a revolutionary threat. I don't think at the time our understanding of the balance of forces was that we're on the verge of a revolution. But that was their understanding. And they've revealed the multiplicity of splits within the state and the white power bloc, which was not just about hawks and doves, as I thought in the 80s. It's much more complex than that. And so reading their reflections on the 80s helped me to understand, I think, a lot better what was actually going on. And then I think the other thing that I never understood, I only understood within the last 2 years or so, because I've been writing up a report for the National Planning Commission on the architecture of South Africa's financial ecosystem. And there's a chapter on the 1980s, the financial system in the 80s. And I didn't realize the significance of the debt standstill and the impact of sanctions and the impact of the Rubicon speech on business. I didn't really fully understand all of those dynamics. So I think what's happened for me is, like, my understanding of the financial system and how it has evolved, and my understanding of how, if you like, the enemy understood us, has helped me to kind of put the 1980s, and in particular 1985, into perspective, and the Langa Massacre. One of the reviewers of the book said, well, obviously Swilling's going to think the Langa Massacre is the center of gravity, because, that's what he wants to say. But in other words, I'm overblowing the significance of it. But I'm using the Langa Massacre really as a contrast to 1960. I really do think, and I agree with Tom Lodge's analysis of Sharpeville 1960, that was a shift in the balance of forces in favor of the regime. The Langa Massacre wasn't the event that resulted in the shift in the balance of force. It was a event, a key event, but not that together with a multiplicity of others, that shifted the balance of forces in favor of the mass democratic movement and the liberation movements. And I think I really think the younger generation needs to understand that story.
I think it's quite interesting now. There's a sort of revisionist history that's coming out from people who were in the apartheid, especially the intelligence services, but also in the military. And I've been reading Henning van Aswegen's really atrocious books about this, but he's writing about the intelligence services But if you read Neil Barnard as well, they essentially say they understood everything from 1985. They understood, and they were planning for negotiations and making sure that the situation was stable so that negotiations could take place. This is a complete counter narrative of what was going on, you know. I mean, if you read what the police were saying at the time and how they were responding. So in the townships of PE and Uitenhage, in fact, I think it was after the Langa Massacre that Magnus Milan and Adrian Vlok came here, and I can't remember the details of who was there and what the dates were, but essentially they said, we have lost control over these townships. You must reassert control by whatever means necessary, because we've lost control. And that was the basis on which they were saying that there are these partial, what the ANC term was partial uprisings. That there's a partial uprising.
That was before the Langa Massacre.
It was before.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they were already aware that they were losing control, which is very interesting to me. But anyway, so the ECC launch was happening on that evening, and we went ahead with this launch. And then the following day, Mike Lowe phoned me and said, he was a journalist at the time, and he said, we've got to go and help. We've got to go, and you can't stay at home. We've got to get to Langa. And then, in fact, one of the Black Sash women, I think it was actually Bobby Malansky and not Molly at that point, but phoned me and said, we are going out to Langa, come and assist us. So I went with her. This must have been the 23rd. I think it wasn't the next day, but the day after. And we were involved with setting up a sort of temporary advice office in one of the church offices in downtown Uitenhage. And people started coming in and saying they were looking for their child who had disappeared. They didn't know where they were. And then we started the business of going around hospitals and morgues and trying to find where people were. I'll tell you, this is in the aftermath of the massacre, where, you know, hundreds of people were missing. Nobody knew if they'd been arrested or dead or so on. And I'll tell you a very touching story was that I was searching for the son of one woman, and I eventually found him in the Bethelsdorp police station, which is some way from Uitenhage. And I went to find this woman and take her to see her son and say, look, here, so he's alive. Here he is, you know, he's in the police station. She was overwhelmingly relieved and grateful. And she went, this is a very poor woman, she went to the bazaars in Uitenhage and bought me a gift of a red handbag that she gave to me as a gift to thank me for finding her son. Anyway, I thought it's a nice story to tell, but it was also just a time really where the violence escalated. And if you remember what happened to the Kini family, I remember my old friend who was a television sound man for one of the international sound crews coming to me I think in KwaNobuhle, and saying to me, do you know what's going on here? These people are being burnt to death. And he was absolutely horrified. I wasn't at that scene. I didn't go near there, but I heard about it firsthand from one of the journalists who was there.
Mona was there. Mona Mandela was there. Yeah.
Mona was there.
Yeah.
As a journalist.
Yeah.
Just to thread briefly again the strand about Molly's story, because this then introduces another character in your book, Mark, is that the Black Sash happened to be having their annual conference in PE, Gqeberha today. And Molly had got a call on the Sunday from parents who were very concerned about their children having disappeared. And so she rounded up 9 colleagues, fellow Black Sash people, drove to to Uitenhage, to the police station. A riot police commander came on duty. This is a Sunday afternoon. And Molly found herself in an altercation with him. His name was Lieutenant John William Fouchier. Di Bishop and the other Black Sash women could smell that there was liquor on his breath. And they whispered that to Molly, and she confronted him. She says, "Have you been drinking?" And she reported him, and he got very aggressive. But John William Fouchier happened to be the police commander that 4 days later was the guy that gave the order to open fire. But Mark, pick up the story from there.
I mean, he had served time on South Africa's border war in northern Namibia, and a couple of days before the massacre, he had discovered the burnt body of a black policeman, and that had made a very profound impact on him. And he referred to that incident when he gave evidence to the Kannemeyer Commission, saying he thought of that burnt body when he was contemplating what would happen to them if this crowd got hold of them, and gave the order to shoot within that context. And also believing, as he said, the translation of the songs of the crowd provided by one of the black policemen, which was "Kill the Boer," which is a song that has significance right up until today. And he put these two together, the image of the black, the charred body of the black policeman, and the possibility that this crowd really was going to go and kill whites. Again, it's all the ironies of this, of the struggles of those days, which contradict the heroic story of the 80s, is really important. That was a big part of the decision. But then once the shooting had taken place, he was obviously involved in making sure that survivors were shot on the ground, because that clearly did happen.
But overlooked the fact that they'd assumed that the boy on the bicycle was dead, and he wasn't. And that he was...
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously he's the type of character that was able to exert quite forceful influence, because the police must have conspired and agreed to all, one after the other, say, no, there was no bicycle. Who knows whether he shot first? Who knows who was the actual individual who shot first? Just interestingly enough, a couple of the policemen in the Caspers had their own personal weapons on their hips, 9mm revolvers and so on.
Can I add something about the relationship to the military as well? So it's interesting what you say about Fouchier having spent time in those border units. I don't know if it was Kufut or which one, but what happened after Uitenhage, after the massacre, as I understand, is that following the instructions from the ministers, that this unit, covert unit, was made up to identify and assassinate the leadership of the PEBCO, the Black Civic Organization, and then Gqeberha, the Cradock Residents Association. And that was the assassinations of the PEBCO 3 in May and the Cradock 4 in June of the same year. So one of the people involved in that unit was Saki van Sail, who also came from a history of being involved in the Rhodesian and Southwest African Bush Wars as a member of Kufut, I think he was. And he was then sent down to PE to be involved with this assassination unit. And I actually interviewed him for the Truth Commission. And interestingly, he said to me, it was not an easy thing to do because he was a soldier. He understood himself as a soldier, and that he killed people who were armed enemies, combatants. And for him to kill a civilian in cold blood, to actually shoot somebody who was an unarmed civilian who he had abducted, he said was counter to his military background.
Yeah, no, that interestingly, another thing I want to give a plug for besides your book, if people can still get it, is there's been a documentary series on the unspoken war, which 5-part series, which I've been found rivetingly interesting.
Riveting. So
And
interesting.
very, very well done, which actually tries to bring in the narratives from all the different sides with 40 years of, space between us. And the interesting thing is that Julie Frederiksen, who features quite strongly in that thing, has also been one of my sources because she interviewed Molly Blackburn as well at the time. But just to get back to your book, Mark, Janet, you mentioned about the Kini murder there, and this is now. It's considered to be one of the first instances of necklacing. And this happened the week afterwards. Say a bit about your dealing with that narrative and what impact that had on you.
I was quite keen on writing a book that didn't try to hide the contradictions and the messiness and the complexities of the struggle, in favor of a more heroic portrayal. I think it's important, and I was fascinated by the trial of Yankees and others who were accused against the doctrine of common purpose, which was a doctrine introduced to allow the courts to find somebody guilty, even though they couldn't prove exactly that they had committed the act, but they were part of a crowd that shared a common purpose. And I was interested in particular in the way in which this crowd emerges. So there is this popular narrative that people are angry, they form a crowd, and they go and kill Kini. But it's not the way it happened. There were a series of moments along the way where a very small group who was worried about the kidnapping and torture of youths, very early that morning, still during the night, and they'd come together to try and find the children. And they engaged with some policemen who were actually fairly collaborative and helped the leadership of that small group to go to the police station. And that leadership came back without the children. And the crowd didn't believe them when they said, no, the children are at the police station and safe. And so a series of incidents happened that built up into a very large crowd, even at the very last point where they had set fire to the building. And the Kini family, or Kini and his sons and others were in the building, realized that the building's burning down, they had to get out. And they climbed through a window, and the crowd was there, and the crowd said, hey, these guys are still alive. Wow. And they begged for their lives. And the crowd said, well, put down the gun that you have, and we'll let you out. And they refused to put down the gun. And that was really the last of a series of incidents that built up over time. At any one point, things could have gone in a different direction. And I think it's important to understand crowd behavior. I mean, E.P. Thompson talks about crowd behavior as the moral economy of a crowd. And what he meant was the moral economy of a crowd is shaped by the underlying structural conditions, yes, but also the immediacy of what's happening in the moment, and as things build up. And that's completely different to the mainstream view of crowd behavior as essentially the subordination of individual rationality, where you, because you're part of the crowd, you become part of a hunting pack with all the irrationalities that follow, and therefore you go and burn people. And it was Dennis Davis who criticized the doctrine of common purpose, saying that actually the doctrine of common purpose undermines the moral economy of the crowd, because the doctrine of common purpose assumes that you become consumed by the irrationality of common purpose to kill. But, that's not empirically, historically, what unfolds in practice.
You're referring to Judge Dennis Davis, I take
Yeah.
it. Yeah, that's right. Now, Janet, you want to comment?
Yeah, just let me add to that and say one of the things that struck me in that build-up to that killing was the allegation that the boys who had been held by, I think it was it Jimmy Clausen who owned the funeral parlor?
Yeah.
That they'd been locked in the fridge,
Cold room.
which was
Yeah.
the cold room to keep corpses in. And that was too horrifying for people. This idea that these boys were being held alive with the dead bodies in a fridge was too horrifying. I think that was, I mean, I can understand that trigger, that people couldn't tolerate that. If you're talking about a moral economy, like trying to understand like why people why they targeted this family.
There's still quite a few things I'm wanting to, talk to you about, Mark. Firstly, you've written this book autobiographically, and that's what I love about it, or semi-autobiographically. And the reason I like it is because in my work with whistleblowers, I say to them, have you owned your story? Because you're going to suffer retaliation. And unless you've internalized and fully owned your story, you're not going to be able to be as resilient as you would like to be. So that's why on my YouTube channel, I have these interviews with whistleblowers telling me their story. And that then fortifies me because, and, I've got quotes there from Ben Ockrey and all these things about how we need to own our stories and internalize them because they're the secret reservoir of our values, blah, blah, blah. And what I loved about it, I mean, maybe it's just my bias being a social worker, I'm always more interested because they say that it's common to oppose a truth, but impossible to resist a story. Your own story comes out in that. And I wonder, however, whether this was traumatizing for you to have to revisit that, because moving on from the Langa Massacre, you then get yourself deeply involved in the process of seeking to have a developmental process whereby we could prevent the forced removals. And in the wake of the emotions of the time, you are very successful in actually working a plan with Plan Act that you worked for to actually find an alternative to them being moved to KwaNobuhle and basically the social fabric being torn apart, only to then find, with the state of emergency declared in 1986, that defeat gets snatched from the jaws of victory. And I just felt myself thinking, do you need a bit of therapy time to actually deal with these? But yet you did not give up. And that's for me the interesting thing, is you didn't just pack for Perth and sort of take an exit. So say a bit about the impact this had on your own spirit and soul.
Yeah, I think it had the opposite effect of traumatization. It was cathartic. The problem with the first version of the story in an academic text like the PhD is that there was no place for the personal story. That was traumatizing. So I think this was liberating, and it was it was a great moment to tell stories that haven't been told before. I mean, the story of the formation of Plan Act was when I was leaving, as I was leaving Uitenhage in 1985 after interviewing people for an article on the massacre and the stairways. The activist said, we've helped you. You're going to do well out of writing your article. How are you going to help us? And I said, well, what help do you need? They said, well, we are fighting forced removals. You need to help us. And we want to upgrade our Langa. We don't want to move. And I knew nothing about any of that stuff. From then on, my entire professional career has been obsessed with infrastructure. Because essentially what they asked is, they want an upgrade plan. And I then met with engineers and architects, and we formed Plan Act, and we've developed a plan for the upgrading of Langa. And why that is significant is that at the time, there was a strong, overwhelming belief in the democratic movement that we were all united in a build-up to detonate the collapse of the apartheid state at some revolutionary moment in the future. That's the Leninist narrative that Janet was referring to earlier. And I argued against that and paid a bit of a price for that and said, no, actually, we're heading towards a stalemate and we'll end up negotiating, which is, of course, what happened. But that's not what people thought was going to happen at that stage. And so when these activists said, listen, we're in control of the township, but we don't know anything about it and how it works, help us develop a plan. That was very much, for me, about moving beyond simply knowing what we're against to transitioning to an articulation of what we formed. And I felt very strongly about that. And I also supported local level, what were then called local level negotiations. So the activists used this plan to enter into negotiations with the enemy. And Kuster Jack was doing that already in the Port Elizabeth area. So for becoming part of that was my story.
John, what you could do is also read this idea of 1985 as a turning point and how it relates to negotiations, together with that book called Breakthrough by Mac Maharaj and Paulo Jordan, which is giving the sort of high-level ANC perspective of how they tried to bring, this is now between 85 and 89, so it's really that period when the ANC started exploring the possibility of negotiation and how they communicated with Nelson Mandela and the prisoners, the leadership, and Oliver Tambo in London, or Lusaka, wherever he was, Lusaka at the time, and the mass movement inside South Africa, and how they tried to bring all those parties onto this idea that negotiations was now a possibility. And it's a really extraordinary story. As Mark says, nothing, you can't assume anything. Like there was no set path, and it could have gone any way at any point.
Could have gone anywhere. But just, one of the stories that I enjoyed being able to tell was going back to Johannesburg and realizing we need some money to do this piece of work for Uitenhage. And I went to see Beyers Naudé as Secretary General of SACC. And his secretary said, you've got 5 minutes. And I went, and she was very stern. And I went in, and there was lots of people around, and I told him the story, listened, put his hand in his jacket pocket, took out a checkbook, wrote a check for 10,000 Rand, and I walked out with 10,000 Rand, and that's how we started Plan Act. And,
now the people who are going to be watching this, just so that you know, we talk about the past never ends, it's all the present. Right now, I tell that story, and because right now, this very moment, I'm involved in a situation in working with whistleblowers that I've been doing for the last 5 years, where the National Lotteries Commission have basically, after 3 years of promising a reparations process for the whistleblowers that have basically have helped expose the corruption in the National Lotteries Commission, have given them peanuts in reparations, and they are so angry. Right now, we are busy on working with lawyers to develop a litigation strategy to take the National Lotteries Commission to court on breach of contract. These are people whose families have been ripped apart, who have been totally devastated, and what they've been offered by the Lotteries Commission is to say, okay, we will give you some food vouchers, grocery vouchers. We'll pay for sessions for counseling for you to go and, to deal with the trauma. And if you need to de-stress, we will pay for you to go and have a session at a spa. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Now, these people are just feeling so angry and outraged. So I've been so empowered, and I'm saying to them, guys, hang on. We might think that defeat's about to be snatched from the jaws of victory. Just read Mark's book to see what was happening in the 80s. That when you thought, P.W. Botha cracked down in 1986, Janet, you were arrested, you spent, a year in detention. So many people thought it was over and done with. I mean, in my own context in KZN, working there, it was just very disillusioning. But yet, the story is that they were resettled. But then something changed. Well, P.W. Botha had a stroke, and there was suddenly an opportunity, and then they came back. So just say a bit about your experience of how you look back now and seeing that.
I'm not so sure I share your optimism. I think people struggling for democracy or for justice, let me put it that way, on the ground now, to some extent, actually have a much tougher time.
I agree.
I'm not just talking about the assassination of activists, quite a few of which we don't even know about, but anybody, and it's actually, if you go to Uitenhage now, it's a town of absolute fear. If anybody tries to do anything in places like that are off the radar, they immediately are threatened with violence by local political mafias. And it's harder now to actually get people organized, especially if you're in the more formal townships. If you're part of a land invasion and you've kind of occupied new space, and you can set up new organizational infrastructures there, it's easier. But operating within the interstices of the existing urban fabric, and if you want to get organized, especially if you're a woman, you are immediately subject to very rapid, violent repression.
Really, Mark?
And so I mean, obviously, if you are connected to lawyers and to media and to organize, which not many people are these days, you can get it out there, which is also very risky. So yeah, I'm not sure I share your optimism.
I get that, and wait till you hear some of the stories that are going to come out when we start this court action. I mean, I was counseling somebody who was suicidal yesterday. So yes, I get your point. The point I'm also at the same time wanting to make, and maybe this is a good question to close off with, is saying, and this is also an excuse for why our book and Molly's taken so long. Simultaneously, we've been having the TRC unfinished business stories being told. We've had the inquest reopened on Gqeberha 4 and all the others. And it's been very helpful to me in the book, because as people have been appearing, at the Gqeberha 4 inquest, people like Sam de Beer, who was a deputy minister, I've interviewed him. And he's been told his story at length about somebody who was in the National Party and how he was, and his own experience of what was going on there. So these are very interesting stories emerging.
I don't think there's been sufficient discussion about how different the 1985 state of emergency was from the 1986 state of emergency. Mm-hmm. The 1985 state of emergency was actually called a partial state of emergency, because it was designed to intensify the focus on the so-called hotspots. As Neil Barnard has now made clear, but many of us actually knew that, the failure of this 85 emergency resulted in a kind of spring period when a whole bunch of negotiations started happening, a whole bunch of conversations, splits in the National Party, splits in the state. It was a very hopeful moment, actually, between the end of the 85 emergency in March 1986 and the declaration of the 86 emergency in, what was it, June, 86. So it's a very brief period where you could actually see what could happen.
I think that's very interesting. So 85 state of emergency here, what the security police did is that they picked up all the key activists and they tortured them severely. That was the Wendy Orr interdict, you remember?
Yes.
Then by the end of 85, actually, we had some important victories because they were released. The consumer boycott also resulted in the withdrawal of the SADF troops from the township, which was really significant. And over that end of 85, early 86, those street and area committees started to really rebuild.
But then, as Neil Barnard makes clear, is PW Botha decided on the Hadaghat option, and Neil Barnard described this as the necessary coup in quite a nonchalant way. Describing it as a necessary coup, it is what was the framework for implementing the winning hearts and minds coupled to counter-revolutionary warfare. And that was the assault on the democratic movement from 1986. But what happened on the ground is, yes, there was the forced removal. But as the splits intensified rather than getting resolved, and Neil Barnard is completely and utterly wrong when he says that 86 was a success. It wasn't a success. It was an absolute failure. And they never, ever shifted the balance of forces in their favor. And so as the 86 emergency started to also dissipate and the activists started getting released, they went back into negotiation mode. They said, we still want to upgrade Langa, which was a surprise to me. But their expectation was that the support people in the NGOs would continue to support them. And they got organized and they put it together. And actually, that was one of the first upgrading plans to be implemented.
And it happened before 1994.
So then in 86, there's the second state of emergency that lasts for 3 years. And what I had documented from the police files was that by 1988, that took them 2 full years, more than 2 full years, they had regained control over the townships. And they said, we can now administer the Black local authority elections. This was in October 88. So they felt that they had regained control through this extended state of emergency where they basically took out in preventative detention. So I was one of them, like the top level leadership for 3 years. I worked this out afterwards. The sort of middle level leadership, like me, for like 6 months to a year. And then the grassroots people for like 2 weeks to 3 months or something like that. But that was their like Uli call. I think they used that in 85, hey Mark, the Uli call idea, that they're these oil spots. But they essentially took control of those situations. So I mean, I don't know about this thing about saying it was a success or not a success or whatever. I mean, they achieved an objective, and they also allowed for that. By 1988, 89, they were allowing those local level initiatives to proceed, which is very interesting because then you had the potential. I mean, I remember in 89 or so, I was working for IDASA, and the township leadership came and said, you must please come and help us negotiate with Eskom because they want to electrify the townships, but their technicians are afraid to work in the townships. So we need like a white comrade who can come and, like reassure them that they can come and work in the townships. So interesting. I mean, that level of control that the PEBCO, I think it was PEBCO at that stage, had over the township.
And what I love about that, coming around, you're talking about protagonism and agency. It's saying that local destinies should and can be decided locally. and with the strong sense of mutual empowerment, solidarity, and agency, and to just kind of let it be known to the politicians who think that top-down planning, etc., is what's going to change things. And what we do have today, and this is what the narrative I keep saying with on the plus side of what's happening with whistleblowers, is we've now got a Bill of Rights and a Constitution, and people can use that and are doing so. And don't let us be discouraged and depressed about the fact that the police and the criminal syndicates are resorting to retaliation and killing people, because that's what they were doing in 1985, and they didn't win. They did not win. Ultimately, that's the story of hope. Well, I think that raises an issue, and again, which I think has been so positive, and which is why I found Molly so interesting, is that she used her relative privilege very strategically. Because she had all these privileges, she got into the PFP, she was elected to the provincial council, and she just played this role, which of course completely maddened, the security establishment. Because what was this woman doing? She was basically challenging a fundamental tenet of the whole apartheid ideology, number one. And number two, she was even being uncomfortable within the PFP at the time, because the PFP were trying to fight things in Parliament, and she was dragging them out of the townships. And in my story, I've gone to sources of people like Jan van Eck and others who said Molly took them kicking and screaming out of the comfortable benches into the townships to experience things. And that had a very catalytic effect on influencing people like Van Slabbert and others to actually to realize that the change wasn't going to happen simply by the passing of laws in Parliament. There had to be this mobilization and connection with the real leaders. And that then led to a point, and I want to just put this back to you, Mark, about stories again, because when I started out on this book, and Molly, a close friend of mine is Wilhelm Verwoerd, and when he got wind of it, he sat me down. He said, now this is another irony. I mean, Wilhelm Verwoerd, the grandson of the architect, he says, John, make sure that you tell the story in such a way that you respect the stories of the other people. And that's why it's taken quite so much longer to write this, is because I've been going and I've got to know people like Koster Jack. And I just wish Weza Made was still alive. And I wish that Mono Bodela was still alive, because I've now come to realize that Willem said, he said, John, he said, black people in this country are still, in a sense, suffering the consequences of of what happened under apartheid, and we can't just write a narrative about this liberal white woman who kind of did all these things. You've got to tell the story as being a human story that intersects with the stories of people. And Mark, you pay huge honor to people like Weza Made, Koster Jack, Omo Bodela, but there are obviously other stories, and I don't know, have you had any thoughts about other people that were important stories that need to be heard and told?
I mean, they're countless. I mean, as Plan Act, we worked with the Weza Madis of life all over the country, and many of them, haven't done too well post '94.
What have we not learned from history that we are now ready to learn, given the passage of time? Because I think, when we're too proximate to the event, we can't quite see it for what it is. But you talk in your book about the benefit of hindsight. It's 20/20 vision. You start to think, what are the lessons which we need to now, that you're trying to kind of bring to the fore, that we need to take hold of so that we actually move things to a different trajectory to what they appear to be going at the moment?
Well, I think, the kind of lessons that I want to draw out are twofold. One is conceptual, come strategic, and the other is organizational. The conceptual one is, I tell the story of a conversation I had with Marxist historian Jeff Guy, who, when I told him I was writing about the Langa Massacre, he described it as an interesting exercise in irrelevant detail. And the reason he is able to say that is, as a Marxist, he's focused on structural contradictions. And these incidents are not that significant. And that comment, which was made to me when I was a very young man, was very hurtful. And it's taken me 40 years to kind of come to terms with that hurt and, in a sense, get my revenge and say, it's not an exercise in irrelevant detail, because if you focus on what in the conclusion I refer to as the intermediate from the work of Christopher Clarke's work on the 1848 revolutions in Europe, he talks about the intermediate plane of causation. This is between structural contradictions on the one hand and the immediacy of everyday politics. It's this intermediate plane where events matter and they accumulate, and you get to a certain point where you hit what he calls a fission point, where a whole bunch of things start happening simultaneously, and things get out of control from the state's point of view and even from the historian's point of view. So I wanted to kind of really bring attention to, which I think is missing in a lot of South African literature, on this intermediate plane of causation, where the interlinkages between events, and Janet wrote a great article about Eastern Cape that I cite, where there is, those linkages are being made. So that's one lesson that I think both activists and academics need to draw from this book. These events matter. Jeff Guy is wrong. The second is, as individuals who have a powerful sense of injustice and are expected by their communities to do something about it and start figuring out ways to get organized, I think they can learn a lot from the 80s about how to do that, including the warning signs, like the differences between leadership elites who have different strategies. Like in Uitenhage, there was one group, and there's the Langa was a different group, and that was true in many places. And how to handle those dynamics and build grassroots organization in a way that is inclusive of the different constituencies within communities, and how to do that. And I think, what I wanted to kind of make explicit in quite a lot of detail is how to organize, how to resist, how to deal with the different constituencies at play. For example, the way the local activists, both in Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage, engaged with the self-appointed local militias, the Amabutu, who saw themselves as the armed wing, and styled themselves as soldiers, and went out on a daily basis to harass the security forces, and were very brave. But they could get out of control. They could also attack members of the community. And so, finding a relationship with them, almost negotiating a bargain, a deal, to figure out, how they are brought under the political leadership. Those kinds of dynamics are really important for activists who are now going to take on authoritarian regimes or corrupt regimes as well.
Good. Janet, your thoughts. What lessons are we now ready to learn that we must learn if we're going to change this trajectory?
No, Mark, now I'm going to have to read your book, and I really don't want to, because it's going to take me back into all that again. I thought you just published your thesis, which I've read, so I didn't need to read it again. But if you've written a personal story, now I have to read that, and that's, I don't know. I get too caught up in reading all these historical reflections. The last couple of years, I've come across two things, and it's in relation to this whole structure and agency debate. But the one is the Cold War, and the narratives that are being presented now are sort of based on a Cold War understanding. And to some extent, if you listen to who were our opponents in those days from the regime side, their narrative is that they are overdetermined by that Cold War politics, if you like. But if you counter that with agency, with our local agency, I think what we learn from that context is that there is always space. And I don't know on what basis Mark is saying that in Uitenhage you can't organize because you get repression immediately, etc. I mean, my experience in the Khwezela township, in Port Elizabeth, in Walmer township, etc., is that there is space to work, as you're saying, Mark, inclusively across different constituencies, working with Amabuto, working with, finding allies within the council, taking over spaces where there is possibility to do things. So there is still enormous potential to put into place those strategies. And I think we need to learn from the positive aspects of what we did in the 1980s.
Mark, can I just ask you, how do people get this book? And when will the print copy emerge?
The print copy will come out, I'm told, during the first quarter of next year. And then I was going to contact Janet and Kusta to have a launch in Gqeberha.
Do that. And maybe Human Rights Day, 21st of March. That should be a big event. Gosh, imagine that. At Langa. That thing.
The electronic copy you can get from the University of Johannesburg website.
It's open source. Yeah. Well, folk, there you have it. I just have one quote to leave you with, to reflect upon, which in a sense expresses the thematic of this whole thing. It's a quote from the Nobel Prize Literature Laureate. The past is never dead. It's not even past. All of us labor in webs spun long before we were born. Webs of heredity and environment, of desire and consequence, of history and eternity. Thank you so much.